He took something from his uncle to a job interview. The boss was surprised by what she found. David Thompson is on the brink of a new beginning. Something old, left by his uncle, may be the key to a literary mystery that changed history. When he enters a small publishing house in Phoenix, he has no idea that his life is about to take an unexpected turn. Amid undisclosed situations, David embarks on a journey that goes beyond a simple job interview. What will he discover? And what secrets does his family's past hold? Prepare for a story of legacy and mystery. David Thompson was at a crossroads in his life. At 35, he found himself unemployed after the company he had worked for nearly a decade went bankrupt. The economy was in decline, and job opportunities were increasingly scarce. With few options in sight, David felt compelled to consider any chance that arose. That's how he found a vacancy at a small publishing house in Phoenix, Arizona, a city he had never considered before. Knowing little about the place and having no other alternatives, he decided to take the risk. On the morning of the interview, David experienced a mix of anxiety and hope. As he dressed, his eyes fell on a special object on the shelf in his room, an old book that belonged to his uncle Arthur. Arthur, an eccentric and solitary man, had been a great collector of rare books. Before passing away, he left David that volume, which, though worn and of little apparent value, held deep significance. It was a rare edition of a collection of short stories that had belonged to David's great-grandfather, a renowned author in the region. David had always believed that the book held something special, something he had yet to discover. The object seemed to carry an energy that connected him directly to his family's legacy, especially his uncle, who had always encouraged him to pursue his dreams in literature. However, David never had the courage to leave the security of his previous job to venture into the uncertain world of words. Now, without a job and with few prospects, he wondered if this was not an opportunity to rediscover what truly mattered to him. Before leaving home, David made an impulsive decision. He took the book, feeling that it might bring him luck in the interview. As he drove to Phoenix, the book rested on the passenger seat, a silent companion on his journey into the unknown. David couldn't explain why, but he felt that this day would be different, that something beyond his expectations was about to happen. When he arrived at the publishing house, David was greeted by a receptionist who asked him to wait. The environment was simple, with shelves full of books of all kinds, but there was something comforting in the simplicity of the place. Sitting in the waiting room, David couldn't stop thinking about the book he had brought with him. He observed it carefully, as if each detail might reveal a secret yet to be discovered. He was nervous, but there was also a growing curiosity, a feeling that this moment could change everything. Finally, after a few minutes, the director's office door opened, and a middle-aged woman with a serious expression appeared. "Mr. Thompson?" she called. David stood up quickly, trying to hide the tension he felt. "I'm Mrs. Bennett, shall we begin?" she said, gesturing for him to follow her to her office. Upon entering the room, David noticed that despite the woman's austere appearance, the environment was inviting, with books piled up in every corner and a large table in the center, where she sat her day. "Please sit," said Mrs. Bennett without much ceremony. David did as she asked and, feeling a bit nervous, placed the book on the table beside the documents he had brought. The interview began traditionally, with questions about his previous experience, skills, and expectations for the future. However, David felt that despite his answers, he was not making an impression on Mrs. Bennett. She kept a neutral expression, as if she had already decided he wasn't the right candidate for the position. David's frustration grew, but he knew he needed to do something to stand out. He looked at the book on the table and, almost without thinking, decided to act. "I brought something with me," he said with slight hesitation. "This book belonged to my uncle. He gave it to me before he passed away. It's a rare edition that belonged to my great-grandfather." The mention of his great-grandfather made Mrs. Bennett look up at the object on the table. "Interesting," she murmured, reaching out to take the book. Seeing the interviewer's interest, David felt a new surge of confidence. My uncle was a great collector of rare books, he explained, trying to keep the conversation going. This was the last gift he gave me. He always said this book was more than it seemed at first glance. The family story seemed to finally capture Mrs. Bennet's attention, and David realized there was something special in the air, something that could change the course of that interview. Mrs. Bennet handled the book carefully, as if sensing the value it carried, both sentimentally and historically. She examined the worn cover and frayed edges, running her fingers over the now faded leather details. "It's truly a rare edition," she commented in a neutral voice, but with a glimmer in her eyes that revealed genuine interest. David watched her every move intently, trying to understand what her reaction might mean for the outcome of the interview. "My uncle always said this book was more than it seemed," David repeated, feeling that he had finally found a way to connect his personal story with the interview. Mrs. Bennet, now clearly intrigued, opened the book carefully, revealing yellowed pages with a faint aroma of old paper. The pages contained short stories written in a style reminiscent of a bygone era, but that wasn't what caught her attention. Mrs. Bennet furrowed her brow as she noticed something unusual between the pages. David noticed the change in her expression and leaned slightly to see what was inside the book. Mrs. Bennet carefully removed a small bundle of folded papers hidden between two pages. "What is this?" she asked, more to herself than to David, as she unfolded the papers with care. David was as surprised as she was. He had never delved much into that book, content to appreciate it as a keepsake from his uncle. "I didn't know there was something inside," he admitted, with a tone of genuine surprise. The sheets that Mrs. Bennet was now examining were old and handwritten. The handwriting was elegant and fluid, contrasting with the seriousness of the ink faded by time. Mrs. Bennet read silently for a few moments, her expression changing from curiosity to something David couldn't immediately identify. It was a mix of surprise and fascination, as if she had just discovered something extraordinary. "These letters," she began with a slightly trembling voice. "They seem to be personal correspondence between two renowned authors of the time. One of them, if I'm not mistaken, is the very great-grandfather you mentioned." She looked up at David, clearly expecting confirmation. David nodded, still trying to process what this meant. "Yes, my great-grandfather was a well-known author in the region, but I didn't know he had correspondence with other authors of the time." Mrs. Bennet seemed lost in her own thoughts. "If what I'm thinking is correct," she said slowly, "these letters could be invaluable. They talk about a lost literary work, something many believed was just a myth." David felt a shiver run down his spine. This was becoming much more than he had ever imagined. What began as a simple job interview was now turning into something much bigger, something he could hardly understand. Mrs. Bennet's words echoed in his mind. A lost work. If that were true, he could be on the verge of a discovery that would change not only his life but also the literary history of the region. "A lost work?" David asked with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Mrs. Bennet carefully closed the letters and placed them back between the pages of the book. "Yes, a work that, if it truly exists, could be one of the most important literary discoveries of the century." She paused, as if pondering what to say next. "I'll be frank with you, David. This book and these letters could change everything, both for you and for this publishing house. I'm impressed with what you've brought here today, but I need to investigate further." David didn't know what to say. The job opportunity he so desperately needed now seemed intertwined with a literary mystery he had never anticipated. Suddenly, the pressure to secure the job seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what had just been revealed. He was on the brink of a journey that promised to be much greater than he had ever dreamed, a journey that could lead him to places he never imagined exploring. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "I just wanted a chance to start over, but now it seems I'm facing something much bigger than I imagined." Mrs. Bennet smiled for the first time since he had entered the room. Sometimes the best opportunities arise when we least expect them. I suggest we take some time to analyze these letters and what they might mean. But for now, I want you to know that I'm seriously considering your application for the position. David left the publishing house with his mind racing. What was supposed to be a simple interview had turned into a literary enigma that could change his life forever. And deep down, he felt that this was just the tip of the iceberg, that many more revelations were yet to come. As David left Mrs. Bennet's office, his mind was racing. The book, which he had always considered just a sentimental keepsake, now seemed to carry much more weight. The letters found between its pages could represent a historical literary discovery, and he was still trying to process what that meant. Walking through the corridors of the small publishing house, he reflected on everything that had happened up to that point and what might be coming. As he returned home, David couldn't help but recall memories of his Uncle Arthur. He had always been an enigmatic figure in his life, a man of few words but with a quiet wisdom that David deeply admired. Arthur never had children, and David was the closest thing to an heir he had, especially when it came to their shared love for books and family history. David remembered how, as a child, he would spend hours listening to his uncle's stories about his great-grandfather, Henry Thompson. Henry was a respected author in his time, but much of his work remained unknown outside the region where he lived. Arthur always insisted that there was more to Henry than the records showed, that his legacy was much greater than the world had recognized. However, in his youth, David never gave much importance to these stories. He followed a different path, seeking security in a stable job and setting aside any literary ambitions he might have had. Only now, without a job and with the letters in hand, was he beginning to understand what his uncle had been trying to convey all those years. Back in his small apartment, David sat at the kitchen table, the book and letters in front of him. He couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Bennet had said about the lost work. Could it be real? Had his great-grandfather really created something so important that it was on the verge of being discovered? With trembling hands, he began to read the letters. The language was old, with a formal tone rarely seen today. It was a correspondence between Henry Thompson and a renowned author of the time, whose name David immediately recognized, Charles Wentworth. Wentworth was a central figure in early 20th century literature, known for his profound and sometimes controversial works. The letters discussed a work that Henry was developing, one that Wentworth described as revolutionary and capable of redefining the literature of the time. However, there was also a sense of mystery in Henry's words. He repeatedly mentioned the need to keep the project secret, something Wentworth respected but with evident impatience. David read with growing fascination. Henry referred to the work as the Book of Echoes, a collection of stories that, according to him, captured the voices and experiences of those who lived in the shadows of official history. However, he never revealed concrete details about the content or where the manuscript might be. Each letter ended with a note of hope, but also of caution. Henry seemed to fear that his work would never be fully understood, that the world might not be ready for what he had created. Wentworth, on the other hand, expressed frustration with the constant delays and Henry's hesitation to share the final manuscript. As he read, David began to realize that these letters were not just a correspondence between two friends. They were the testimony of a collaborative effort to create something truly innovative. However, the fate of the work remained a mystery. The last letter, dated shortly before Henry's death, ended abruptly with a note about a necessary journey he needed to take to protect his work. David felt a shiver as he imagined what might have happened to his great-grandfather. Did he really complete the Book of Echoes? And if so, where was it now? Curiosity and a sense of responsibility began to weigh on his shoulders. Perhaps it was his duty to find this lost work and bring it to light, not just to honor his great-grandfather's memory, but also to fulfill what his uncle had always believed he was capable of doing. The decision to seek answers was made. David knew that to move forward, He would need to return to his family's roots, revisit places and stories he had left behind for so long. He would need to discover more about his great-grandfather and his work, and perhaps, just maybe, he would find what was meant to be found. However, he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. He would need Mrs. Bennet's help and possibly others who were well-versed in the literary world and the mysteries it held. But before anything else, he needed to decide if he was ready to face the challenges that would surely come with this search. David knew that following this path could change his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. The security of a stable job seemed increasingly distant, replaced by a journey of self-discovery and adventure that he had never imagined. However, he felt that this was the right choice, that this was the chance to reconnect with his true passion for literature and honor his family's legacy. In the days following the interview, David couldn't think of anything other than the letters and the mysterious book. Each time he reread those words, it became clearer that he was facing a discovery that could have profound implications, both for him and for the literary world. However, along with the excitement, there also came great responsibility. What should he do next? Reveal the letters to the world? Search for his great-grandfather's lost work? Or simply keep everything as a family relic? David knew he needed guidance. He decided to return to the publishing house and seek out Mrs. Bennet. He believed that she, with her experience and knowledge, could help him make the best decision. When he arrived at the small publishing house, he was greeted by the same receptionist as before, who, recognizing him, immediately led him to the boss's office. Mrs. Bennet received him with a serious expression, but there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "David, I've been thinking a lot about what we discovered during your last visit," she began, as she invited him to sit. "These letters are a window into a crucial moment in literary history, and if there really is a lost work, as the letters suggest, it could be a monumental discovery." David nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I've also been thinking a lot about it, Mrs. Bennet, and that's why I'm here. I need your help to understand what I should do. I don't know if I'm prepared to handle all of this alone." Mrs. Bennet leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "David, the first thing you need to understand is that this is not a decision to be taken lightly. We're talking about something that could change the perception of your great-grandfather's work and potentially that of Charles Wentworth himself. The question is, are you willing to go down this path, knowing it may be full of challenges and uncertainties?" David took a deep breath. He knew this was an important question. If he decided to proceed, his life would never be the same. He would have to dedicate time and effort to discovering the truth about the Book of Echoes, and perhaps even get involved in publishing the work, if it truly existed. "I don't know what I'll find," he said finally, "but I feel that I owe it to my uncle and my great-grandfather. They believed in something that was never fully revealed. And if there really is a lost work, I think it's my responsibility to try to find it." Mrs. Bennet smiled slightly, as if she had already expected that response. "I'm glad to hear that, David, and I'm willing to help you in any way I can. In fact, I've already started doing some research on my own. There are records that Henry Thompson took a trip shortly before his death, as he mentioned in the last letter. He went to a small village in the interior of Arizona, a place almost no one knows about. Maybe that's the starting point for our search." David felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Do you think the work could be hidden there?" "It's a possibility," she replied, "but we need to be careful. If we move too quickly or carelessly, we could end up revealing the location before we're ready, and that could attract unwanted attention. We need a plan." David agreed, knowing that Mrs. Bennet was right. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to move forward. They spent the next few hours discussing the details of the investigation. They decided that the first step would be to visit the village mentioned in the letter, to try to find clues about where Henry might have hidden the manuscript, if he indeed did. However, there was another issue at play. If they found the work, what would they do with it? Publish it immediately? Keep it until all the details were verified? Mrs. Bennet suggested that if the manuscript were found, the best course of action would be to work together with experts in ancient literature, ensuring that the work was treated with the respect and importance it deserved. Before saying goodbye, Mrs. Bennet made one last observation. David, you're entering unknown territory. This could change your life, but it could also bring many challenges. Just make sure this is what you really want. David reflected for a moment. He knew his life could be much simpler if he gave up this quest and accepted the job Mrs. Bennet had practically offered him. However, a part of him knew that this was a unique opportunity, a chance to discover something that could change his family's history forever. Yes, he finally said, I want to do this. I want to discover the truth. Mrs. Bennet nodded, satisfied with his determination. Then let's move forward, David. Let's find out what your great-grandfather left behind. With that, they began preparing the trip to the small village mentioned in the letters, where they hoped to find the answers they were seeking. David felt the weight of the decision he had made, but at the same time he was excited to start this new journey. He knew his life would never be the same. David and Mrs. Bennet set off early the next morning toward the village mentioned in the letters. The place, practically forgotten by time, was a few hours' drive north of Phoenix, in the heart of the Arizona desert. As they approached, the scenery around them became more arid, and the landscape, marked by rocky hills and cacti, seemed almost untouched by modernity. During the journey, David reflected on the significance of that moment. He wasn't just searching for a manuscript. He was searching for a connection with his past, with his family's roots. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of excitement. What would they find in that village? Could it be possible that the mystery guarded for so many decades was about to be revealed? When they finally arrived at the village, David and Mrs. Bennet were greeted by a simple scene, almost as if they had traveled back in time. There were few houses, all built in a rustic style, and the dirt streets seemed deserted. It was hard to imagine that there, in that remote place, a literary treasure could be hidden. They began their investigation, asking the local residents about Henry Thompson, and if anyone remembered a visit he might have made there decades ago. Most of the people they approached had no knowledge of Henry, but an elderly woman, who lived in a small house at the edge of the village, seemed to remember something. Henry Thompson? She repeated, narrowing her eyes as she thought. Yes, I remember a man by that name. That was a long time ago. He stayed here for a few weeks, but he was a reserved man, didn't talk much. They said he was writing something important. I don't know what happened to him afterward, but he used to spend hours in a cave in the hills. They said it was a place where he found inspiration. David and Mrs. Bennet exchanged meaningful looks. The cave could be the key to discovering the whereabouts of the lost work. They thanked the woman for the information and immediately set off toward the hills. The path was difficult, and the desert heat made the hike even more exhausting, but both were determined to continue. After about an hour of walking, they spotted the entrance to a cave hidden among the rocks. The place had an aura of mystery, as if it held secrets that no one had discovered. They entered cautiously, using flashlights to light the way, as the interior was dark and cold. The cave was larger than it appeared at first glance. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, creating an almost supernatural atmosphere. David's heart was racing, a mix of fear and excitement overwhelming him. He knew they were close to something important. Finally, they reached a small chamber at the back of the cave. There, hidden in a corner, wrapped in old cloths and dust, they found a wooden chest covered by decades of dust and cobwebs. David's hands trembled as he knelt before the chest, feeling the antiquity and weight of the object. Mrs. Bennet lit a more powerful flashlight, illuminating the chest as David, with tremendous effort, lifted the lid. Inside, in perfect condition, was a thick leather-bound manuscript. The gold letters on the cover, though worn by time, were still legible. The Book of Echoes. David remained motionless for a few seconds, unable to believe what he was seeing. There it was, his great-grandfather's lost manuscript, the one the letters spoke of, the project that had so intrigued Charles Wentworth. David could hardly breathe as he ran his hand over the embossed letters on the cover of the book. "This is it," Mrs. Bennet murmured, her voice filled with reverence. "You found it, David. This is the work your great-grandfather so fiercely protected." David opened the book carefully. The pages were impeccable, as if time had not passed. The content, as promised in the letters, appeared to be a collection of stories. But there was more. The stories were interconnected in a complex way, reflecting the lives of people forgotten by official history, the voices of those who had no place in the grand records. It was a work that captured the essence of humanity in its purest and most vulnerable form. As he leafed through the pages, David realized the depth of what he held in his hands. It was not just a book. It was a testament to past lives, of sorrows and joys that echoed through the generations. He felt the weight of the responsibility to share that work with the world, but at the same time, he knew that he needed to do it correctly, respecting his great-grandfather's vision. "We need to take this to the publishing house," Mrs. Bennet said, breaking the reverent silence that had settled in the cave. "This needs to be studied, preserved, and if possible, published. The world needs to know this work." David agreed. He knew that by discovering the Book of Echoes, he had found much more than a simple family relic. He had found a legacy, something that connected him back to his roots and that now was part of his own journey. As they left the cave, David felt a mix of emotions. The discovery would change not only his life but also the perception of his family's literary history. He knew that this was only the beginning of something much greater, a journey that would lead him to discover more about himself and the legacy he had inherited. Back at the publishing house, David and Mrs. Bennet faced a new challenge: how to handle the discovery of the Book of Echoes in a way that honored Henry Thompson's legacy while also bringing the work to light properly. The small publishing house, which had once seemed like just another job opportunity for David, now became the epicenter of a potential literary revolution. The first decision was to involve experts in ancient literature to verify the authenticity and importance of the manuscript. Mrs. Bennet, with her extensive experience in the publishing world, immediately contacted academic colleagues and experts who could help in this process. Within a few days, the publishing house was transformed into a center of analysis and discussion, with scholars from all over interested in the manuscript and what it might reveal. David, who had never been involved in anything like this, felt a bit out of place among so many brilliant minds, but he also knew that his personal connection to the book made him an essential part of the process. He met daily with Mrs. Bennet and the experts, discussing details about the manuscript, learning about preservation, and the best ways to approach the publication of such a delicate work. As the work progressed, more and more surprising aspects of the Book of Echoes came to light. Scholars began to realize that the work was not just a collection of stories, but rather a veiled social critique that addressed themes like injustice, inequality, and the invisibility of the most vulnerable in society. Henry Thompson, through his writing, had given a voice to those who were ignored or silenced at the time. One of the biggest revelations came when one of the experts, carefully examining the margins of the pages, found handwritten notes by Charles Wentworth. These were notes on how he planned to promote the work and how he intended to write a preface explaining the historical and literary significance of the book. This not only confirmed the collaboration between the two authors, but also showed how close the book had been to being published before it was lost to history. For David, this process was transformative. He had gone from a man in search of a job to someone now carrying the weight of a literary inheritance. His connection to Henry Thompson, once distant and almost mythical, was now tangible and real. Every page he read, every new discovery, made him feel closer to his great-grandfather and more determined to honor his memory. As the days passed, David's relationship with the work and the publishing house deepened. He found himself involved in every decision, from choosing the experts to the publishing plans. What had once seemed like a simple historical rescue now transformed into a personal mission to give a voice to a forgotten generation, to bring to light the stories that needed to be heard. Mrs. Bennet, who had initially seen David as just another candidate for a position, now respected him as someone with a genuine and important connection to the manuscript. She trusted his decisions and valued his contributions, recognizing that he had become a key player in the entire process. She saw in him the determination and passion needed to lead the dissemination of this work to the world. Finally, the day arrived when the first printed copy of the Book of Echoes was ready. It was a limited edition, with a leather cover similar to the original manuscript, and it included Charles Wentworth's notes and a preface written by one of the foremost experts in ancient literature. David held the book in his hands, feeling the weight of history and the responsibility he had in continuing his family's legacy. "You did it, David," Mrs. Bennet said with a smile of satisfaction. "Your great-grandfather would be proud." David looked at the book and then at Mrs. Bennet, feeling a deep gratitude for all the support and guidance he had received. "This is just the beginning," he replied. "There is still much more to be discovered and shared." David's journey, which began with a simple job interview, had turned into a deep search for identity, history, and purpose. He had not only found the Book of Echoes, but he had also found himself rediscovering his passion for literature and his connection to the past. Now, he was ready to face new challenges, knowing that he carried with him the legacy of a family of storytellers, of people who, like him, believed in the power of words to change the world. And with that, David was determined to continue this mission, bringing the stories his great-grandfather began to write to the world.